The morning sun filters through my kitchen window as I stand at the counter, my hands trembling slightly as I reach for the pill organizer that should contain my heart medication. But the compartment for Tuesday is empty, just like it has been for the past 3 days. My name is Margaret Chen. I'm 67 years old, and I'm about to tell you how my daughter-in-law nearly killed me with her twisted idea of what constitutes proper medical care. What started as small acts of control escalated into a dangerous game that threatened my life, but it also awakened something in me that I thought had died along with my late husband 2 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Standing in my own kitchen, staring at that empty pill organizer, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that comes when my medication is missed. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who insisted she was protecting this family's finances by questioning every prescription was the same person who could end up costing them everything if something happened to me. But Jessica, my son David's wife of 4 years, had made it clear that she believed my medications were unnecessary expenses, elaborate placebos designed to drain their inheritance before I had the decency to pass away quietly. 3 days ago, I had watched through my bedroom window as Jessica rummaged through the bathroom medicine cabinet, emerging with several of my prescription bottles. When I confronted her about it later, she smiled that sweet, condescending smile that had become her signature expression whenever she dealt with me. "Oh, Mom Chen," she said, using the fake-affectionate tone that made my skin crawl. "Dr. Williams is just trying to keep you dependent on all these pills. You're stronger than you think. Sometimes we need to wean ourselves off these things naturally." The thing about Jessica Martinez Chen is that she arrived in our family like a perfectly wrapped gift that you're almost afraid to open because the packaging is too beautiful to disturb. When David first brought her home for Christmas dinner 3 years ago, she seemed like everything I had hoped my son would find in a partner. She was charming, articulate, and had this way of making everyone in the room feel like they were the most important person she had ever met. She worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative, which should have been my first warning sign about her complicated relationship with medication, but at the time it seemed impressive and professional. Jessica had grown up in a family that viewed doctors with suspicion and believed that most medical interventions were designed to create dependency rather than cure ailments. Her grandmother had lived to 94, she would tell anyone who would listen, and had never taken a prescription medication in her entire life. This family philosophy had served as the foundation for Jessica's worldview, and she carried it into our home like a missionary bringing salvation to the heathens. The first few months after David and Jessica moved into my house were a delicate dance of boundaries and expectations. My husband Robert had passed away suddenly from a stroke, leaving me rattled and alone in the 4-bedroom colonial we had shared for 38 years. David suggested that he and Jessica move in temporarily to help me adjust and to save money for their own house down payment. It seemed like a perfect solution for everyone involved, and I was grateful for the company and the sense of family that their presence restored to rooms that had felt too quiet and empty. Jessica immediately began reorganizing the household with an efficiency that was both impressive and slightly unsettling. She took over the grocery shopping, meal planning, and general management of daily routines with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting her entire life for the opportunity to run a household. She created elaborate meal plans, focused on what she called natural healing foods, and began replacing my usual grocery staples with organic alternatives that cost twice as much, but were supposedly infinitely better for our collective health. The kitchen became Jessica's domain, and she transformed it into what she called a wellness center, where she prepared elaborate smoothies and herbal teas designed to address various ailments naturally. She subscribed to health magazines and online wellness blogs, constantly researching new approaches to nutrition and natural healing. The woman who sold pharmaceuticals for a living spent her evenings reading about how to avoid needing them, which should have struck me as contradictory, but at the time I found her dedication admirable. David seemed completely enchanted by Jessica's take-charge attitude and her commitment to optimizing our family's health. He had always been somewhat passive about household management, content to let others handle the details, while he focused on his work as a software engineer. Jessica's competence in areas where he felt uncertain made him feel like he had found the perfect partner, someone who could handle all the complicated aspects of adult life that he preferred to avoid. For the first 6 months, I appreciated Jessica's organizational skills and her obvious devotion to David's well-being. She packed nutritious lunches for him every morning, researched the best route for his commute, and created systems for managing household expenses that impressed me with their thoroughness. She seemed genuinely committed to making our unconventional living arrangement work smoothly, and I began to think that perhaps David had indeed found someone special. The gradual shift in Jessica's behavior toward me was so subtle that I almost missed it entirely. It started with small comments about my daily routines and habits, observations that were framed as helpful suggestions but carried an undertone of criticism. She would mention that my morning coffee routines seemed excessive, suggesting that perhaps I was developing an unhealthy dependence on caffeine that might be affecting my sleep patterns. She questioned my evening ritual of watching the news, implying that exposure to negative media might be contributing to what she perceived as my generally anxious disposition. Jessica's background in pharmaceutical sales had given her just enough medical knowledge to be dangerous. She understood the names of medications and their general purposes, but she lacked the deeper understanding of how these drugs worked in complex medical situations. This partial knowledge made her confident in making pronouncements about medical care that sounded authoritative, but were actually quite superficial. She would research my prescriptions online and present me with articles about potential side effects or alternative natural treatments, always framing her research as concern for my well-being. The first direct confrontation about my medications occurred during my regular 3-month checkup with Dr. Williams, my cardiologist. I had been seeing Dr. Williams for over 5 years, ever since my first mild heart attack had revealed the extent of my cardiovascular problems. He had carefully calibrated a medication regimen that included a beta blocker, a blood thinner, and a cholesterol-lowering statin, along with a few other medications designed to support my heart function and prevent future cardiac events. Jessica insisted on accompanying me to this appointment, ostensibly to help me remember the doctor's instructions and to provide moral support. But once we were in Dr. Williams' office, she began asking pointed questions about the necessity of each medication and whether there might be natural alternatives that could achieve the same results with fewer side effects. Dr. Williams patiently explained the importance of each prescription and the potential consequences of discontinuing any of them without medical supervision. But Jessica's questions became increasingly challenging and skeptical. After the appointment, as we drove home, Jessica expressed her opinion that Dr. Williams seemed overly committed to keeping me on medications that might not be necessary. She suggested that perhaps he had financial incentives to prescribe certain drugs, or that he was simply following outdated protocols that didn't account for newer research about natural healing approaches. Her pharmaceutical sales background, she claimed, had shown her how profit-driven the medical industry could be, and she felt a responsibility to protect me from potentially exploitive practices. David's response to these concerns was to defer entirely to Jessica's judgment. He had never been comfortable with medical matters and was grateful to have someone who seemed knowledgeable and confident taking charge of decisions that felt overwhelming to him. When Jessica suggested that we might want to get a second opinion about my medications, David enthusiastically supported the idea, seeing it as a reasonable precaution rather than a challenge to established medical care. The second opinion appointment was a disaster from the beginning. Jessica had researched doctors who were known for their integrative approaches to medicine, and she found Dr. Amanda Foster, a physician who advertised her practice as focusing on whole-person wellness and reducing pharmaceutical dependency through natural interventions.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Dr. Foster's office was decorated with crystals and essential oil diffusers, and her intake forms included questions about my spiritual practices and emotional well-being, alongside traditional medical history. Dr. Foster's examination was thorough, but her conclusions were alarming. She suggested that my current medication regimen was likely excessive, and that many of my symptoms could be addressed through dietary changes, exercise modifications, and stress reduction techniques. She proposed a gradual reduction in my medications, starting with what she considered the least essential prescriptions, and monitoring my response before making further adjustments. Jessica was thrilled with this recommendation and immediately began planning a that would support my transition away from pharmaceutical dependence. The conflict between Dr. Williams' recommendations and Dr. Foster's suggestions created a medical dilemma that Jessica was eager to resolve in favor of the natural approach. She researched each of my medications extensively, printing out articles about potential side effects and long-term health risks associated with extended use. She created elaborate charts showing how various supplements and dietary changes could potentially replace the functions of my prescription drugs, and she developed a timeline for gradually reducing my medication dosages while implementing these natural alternatives. David found himself caught between his desire to support Jessica's health initiatives and his concern about contradicting established medical advice. He suggested that we consult with Dr. Williams about incorporating some of Dr. Foster's recommendations into my existing treatment plan, but Jessica dismissed this idea as unnecessarily cautious. She argued that Dr. Williams had too much invested in his current approach to be objective about alternatives, and that we needed to be willing to take charge of my health rather than passively accepting whatever doctors recommended. The first medication Jessica convinced me to discontinue was the cholesterol-lowering statin, which she argued was unnecessary given her plans to address my cholesterol levels through dietary changes. She had researched extensively about the potential side effects of statins, including muscle pain and cognitive impairment, and she presented a compelling case that the risks might outweigh the benefits for someone my age. Dr. Foster had agreed that statins were often overprescribed and that dietary interventions could be equally effective for managing cholesterol levels. For the first few weeks after discontinuing the statin, I felt no immediate negative effects, which Jessica interpreted as validation of her approach. She monitored my energy levels and general well-being carefully, documenting any improvements that she could attribute to reducing my pharmaceutical burden. She increased my intake of oatmeal, added more omega-3 rich foods to my diet, and encouraged me to take longer walks around the neighborhood as part of what she called my natural cholesterol management program. The success with the statin gave Jessica confidence to tackle what she considered the next unnecessary medication in my regimen. She had become convinced that the blood thinner I was taking was creating more risks than benefits, particularly given my age and the potential for dangerous bleeding if I had an accident. She researched natural blood thinning alternatives like garlic, ginger, and fish oil supplements, and she argued that these could provide similar cardiovascular protection without the risks associated with prescription anticoagulants. This time, however, I was more hesitant to follow Jessica's recommendations. The blood thinner had been prescribed after my heart attack specifically to prevent blood clots that could cause another cardiac event or a stroke. Dr. Williams had been very clear about the importance of this medication, and I felt nervous about discontinuing it without his explicit approval. But Jessica's arguments were persuasive, and she had David's complete support for her natural healing approach. The turning point came when Jessica began questioning the necessity of my beta blocker, the medication that controlled my heart rate and blood pressure. This was the medication that Dr. Williams had described as absolutely essential for preventing future heart attacks, and I knew that discontinuing it could have immediate and dangerous consequences. But Jessica had convinced herself that my heart problems were largely stress-related, and that addressing the underlying emotional and lifestyle factors would eliminate the need for pharmaceutical intervention. Jessica's research had led her to believe that beta blockers could actually weaken the heart over time by preventing it from working naturally to regulate its own rhythm. She found articles and testimonials from people who had successfully weaned themselves off these medications through exercise, meditation, and dietary changes. She developed an elaborate plan for gradually reducing my beta blocker dosage while implementing what she called natural heart strengthening protocols that included specific exercises, breathing techniques, and herbal supplements. The morning I discovered my missing heart medication, I realized that Jessica had moved beyond trying to convince me to reduce my prescriptions and had begun making these decisions unilaterally. When I confronted her about the missing pills, she didn't deny taking them, but she framed her actions as protecting me from my own reluctance to embrace healthier alternatives. She had decided that I was too emotionally attached to my medications to make rational decisions about discontinuing them, and that she needed to intervene for my own good. "Mom Chen," she said, her voice taking on the patient tone usually reserved for explaining complex concepts to children. "I understand that giving up these medications feels scary, but you're stronger than you realize. Your body wants to heal naturally, but these drugs are preventing that process. Sometimes we need someone who loves us to help us make the difficult choices that our fear prevents us from making ourselves." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, but more alarming was her complete confidence in her decision to override both my wishes and my doctor's medical judgment. Jessica had appointed herself as the final authority on my medical care, and she seemed genuinely surprised that I wasn't grateful for her intervention. She had convinced herself that she was saving me from the harmful effects of unnecessary medications, and my resistance to her help was simply evidence that I had been brainwashed by the medical establishment. That evening, as I lay in bed feeling the irregular rhythm of my unmedicated heart, I realized that my situation had become genuinely dangerous. Jessica's well-intentioned but misguided attempts to improve my health were actually threatening my life, and her complete certainty about her approach made it impossible to reason with her. David's unwavering support for his wife's decisions meant that I couldn't count on him to intervene on my behalf, and I began to understand that I would need to find a way to protect myself. The next morning, I called Drive, William's office, and spoke to his nurse about my situation. I explained that my daughter-in-law had taken my medications and was preventing me from taking them, but I was careful not to frame it as a deliberate attempt to harm me. I described Jessica's concerns about pharmaceutical dependency and her belief that natural alternatives would be better for my health, hoping that Dr. Williams might be able to provide some medical evidence that would convince her to return my medications. Dr. Williams called me back within an hour, and his voice carried a gravity that made my chest tighten with anxiety. He explained that discontinuing my heart medications abruptly could trigger exactly the kind of cardiac event they were designed to prevent, and that my irregular heartbeat and chest tightness were warning signs that my cardiovascular system was already being stressed by the missing medication. He wanted me to come to his office immediately for an evaluation, and he suggested that we might need to involve other family members or even adult protective services if Jessica continued to interfere with my medical care. The conversation with Dr. Williams crystallized the reality of my situation in a way that was both terrifying and oddly liberating. For months, I had been questioning my own judgment and deferring to Jessica's confident assertions about my medical needs. But hearing my doctor's serious concern about the immediate dangers I was facing helped me understand that this wasn't a difference of opinion about treatment approaches. It was a situation where someone was making medical decisions that could literally kill me. That afternoon, while Jessica was at work and David was in his home office attending virtual meetings, I began developing what I would later think of as my survival plan. I couldn't simply confront Jessica directly about returning my medications, because she had already demonstrated that she would dismiss my concerns as irrational fear. I couldn't rely on David to support me against his wife's medical opinions, because he had completely abdicated responsibility for these decisions to her. I needed to find a way to protect myself that didn't depend on convincing either of them that Jessica's approach was dangerous. The first step in my plan was to secure an emergency supply of my most critical medications. I called Dr. Williams' office and explained that I needed a few days' worth of pills to bridge a gap in my prescription refills, which wasn't technically a lie since Jessica had created exactly that kind of gap. His nurse was sympathetic and arranged for me to pick up a small supply that afternoon, with the understanding that we would address the larger situation during my emergency appointment the following day. Getting to the pharmacy without Jessica's knowledge required some careful planning. I waited until she left for her afternoon sales calls, then asked my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, if she could drive me to run a quick errand. Mrs. Patterson was a retired teacher who had been my friend for over a decade, and she was happy to help without asking too many questions about why I needed transportation for such a short trip. Standing in the pharmacy, holding those small bottles of medication that represented the difference between life and death for me, I felt both relief and sadness. Relief that I would be able to protect my immediate health, but sadness that my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law had deteriorated to the point where I needed to hide my medical care from them. I had never imagined that living with family could become a situation where I felt unsafe and unsupported, but Jessica's misguided attempts to control my health had created exactly that dynamic. That evening, I took my missed medications for the first time in 3 days, and the relief was immediate and profound. My heart rhythm stabilized, The tightness in my chest eased, and I felt like I could breathe properly for the first time since Jessica had confiscated my pills. But I also realized this was only a temporary solution to a much larger problem. Jessica's commitment to her natural healing philosophy wasn't going to change simply because I had found a way to circumvent her interference, and I needed a more comprehensive plan for protecting myself going forward. The second phase of my survival plan involved documentation. I began keeping a detailed journal of Jessica's comments about my medications, her attempts to substitute natural remedies for prescribed treatments, and the physical symptoms I experienced when she interfered with my medical care. I took photos of my empty pill organizer and made notes about the dates and times when my medications went missing. I wasn't sure exactly how I would use this information, but I understood that I might need evidence to support my version of events if the situation escalated further. I also began researching my legal rights as an elderly person living in my adult child's household. I discovered that elder abuse could include medical neglect or interference with prescribed treatments, and that there were resources available for seniors who felt unsafe or unsupported in their living situations. This research was both empowering and frightening, because it helped me understand that my situation was serious enough to warrant outside intervention, but it also forced me to confront the possibility that I might need to make dramatic changes to my living arrangement. The third component of my plan involved building a support network outside of my immediate household. I reconnected with old friends who had maintained their independence as they aged, and I began attending senior center activities that I had previously declined because Jessica insisted they were unnecessary for someone with a supportive family. These connections reminded me that there were people in my life who valued my judgment and respected my autonomy, even if my own family had begun treating me like an incompetent child. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a particularly valuable ally in my developing support network. She had been a high school principal before retiring, and she had experience dealing with situations where well-meaning family members made decisions that weren't in someone's best interest. When I carefully explained my situation with Jessica's medical interference, Mrs. Patterson immediately understood the seriousness of the problem and offered to help me navigate potential solutions. Through Mrs. Patterson, I learned about a support group for seniors dealing with difficult family dynamics, and I began attending their weekly meetings at the community center. Listening to other people's stories about adult children who had become overly controlling or family members who dismissed their concerns helped me understand that my situation wasn't unique, and that there were strategies for asserting my independence without destroying important relationships. The support group also connected me with resources for seniors who needed assistance managing their healthcare independently. I learned about medication management services, transportation options for medical appointments, and advocacy organizations that could help seniors navigate conflicts with family members about medical care. For the first time since Jessica had begun interfering with my medications, I felt like I had options beyond simply enduring her control or engaging in confrontations that I was unlikely to win. But even as I was building this external support network and developing strategies for protecting my health, I was also grappling with the emotional complexity of my situation. Jessica genuinely believed that she was helping me, and her actions came from a place of concern rather than malice. David's support for his wife's decisions reflected his trust in her judgment rather than any desire to harm me. The tragedy of our situation was that their love and concern had been channeled in ways that were actually dangerous for me, and I wasn't sure how to address the underlying problem without damaging relationships that were important to all of us. The breakthrough in my understanding came during a conversation with Dr. Williams during my emergency appointment. He helped me recognize that Jessica's interference with my medical care wasn't just a family conflict or a difference of opinion about treatment approaches. It was a serious medical safety issue that required immediate intervention. He explained that my cardiovascular condition was complex and potentially life-threatening, and that the medications she was preventing me from taking weren't optional lifestyle choices but essential medical interventions. Dr. Williams also helped me understand that Jessica's pharmaceutical sales background, rather than making her qualified to make medical decisions, actually created a dangerous overconfidence in her ability to evaluate complex medical situations. Her familiarity with drug names and basic mechanisms of action gave her enough knowledge to feel authoritative, but not enough understanding to recognize the limitations of her expertise. This combination of partial knowledge and complete confidence was potentially lethal in situations involving serious medical conditions. Armed with this clearer understanding of the medical realities of my situation, I began developing the final phase of my survival plan. Rather than simply finding ways to work around Jessica's interference, I needed to create a situation where she would be forced to confront the consequences of her actions and hopefully recognize the need to change her approach. This wouldn't be easy, because it would require me to be more assertive and confrontational than I had been comfortable being throughout this entire ordeal. The opportunity to implement this final phase of my plan came sooner than I expected, and in a way that was both more dramatic and more effective than anything I could have planned deliberately. But before I could put my strategy into action, I needed to prepare for the possibility that asserting my independence might fundamentally change my relationship with David and Jessica, and potentially even my living situation. The woman who had been hiding medications in her bedroom and sneaking to the pharmacy was about to become someone who demanded respect for her autonomy and refused to accept anyone else's control over her medical care. Looking back on those weeks of careful planning and secret medication management, I realized that Jessica's misguided attempt to control my health had actually awakened something in me that had been dormant since Robert's death. I had been so grateful to have family support during my grief and adjustment that I had allowed my own judgment and independence to atrophy. But the threat to my immediate survival had forced me to rediscover my capacity for strategic thinking and self-advocacy, qualities that would prove essential for everything that was about to unfold. The morning Jessica discovered my hidden medication stash changed everything between us, though not in the way either of us expected. I had been carefully managing my secret supply for nearly 2 weeks, taking my pills early in the morning before anyone else was awake, and storing them in a small jewelry box that I kept in my bedroom closet. My heart rhythm had stabilized, my energy had returned, and I was sleeping better than I had since this whole ordeal began. For the first time in months, I felt like I was thinking clearly and making rational decisions about my own well-being. Jessica's discovery happened by accident, or at least I thought it was an accident at the time. She had offered to help me organize my closet, claiming that she wanted to make more efficient use of the storage space now that 3 adults were sharing the house. I should have been more suspicious of her sudden interest in my personal belongings, but I was so relieved to be feeling physically better that I hadn't been paying close enough attention to her movements around the house. When she opened my jewelry box and found the small bottles of pills nestled between my grandmother's pearl necklace and my wedding ring, her reaction was swift and intense. "Mom Chen," she said, her voice tight with what sounded like a mixture of hurt and anger. "Where did these come from? I thought we had agreed that you were going to try the natural approach for a few weeks to see how your body responded." The word "agreed" struck me as particularly offensive, since I didn't recall having any meaningful input into the decision to discontinue my medications. But I also realized that this confrontation was inevitable, and that how I handled it would determine whether I could continue living in this house while maintaining control over my own medical care. The woman who had been sneaking around with hidden pills was about to need to become someone who could stand up for herself openly and directly. "Jessica," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, "I never agreed to stop taking my heart medication. You took my pills without my permission, and I replaced them because I need them to stay alive. This isn't about trying different approaches to wellness. This is about preventing a heart attack." Her face flushed with indignation, and I could see that she was genuinely shocked by what she perceived as my betrayal of our family's commitment to natural healing. "Mom Chen, I can't believe you would sneak around behind our backs like this. David and I have been working so hard to create a healthy environment for all of us, and you've been undermining everything we're trying to accomplish. Don't you trust us to know what's best for your health?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge, and I realized that this was the moment when I would either reclaim my autonomy or surrender it completely. Jessica's assumption that she and David had the right to determine what was best for my health was so fundamentally wrong that I felt anger rising in my chest for the first time since this whole situation had begun. "Jessica," I said, my voice becoming firmer than it had been in months, "I don't need you to decide what's best for my health. I have a cardiologist who has been managing my heart condition for 5 years, and I trust his medical judgment more than I trust your internet research. You don't have the training or the authority to make decisions about my prescription medications, and I won't allow you to continue interfering with my medical care." The word allow seemed to trigger something in Jessica that I hadn't seen before. Her carefully maintained facade of concern and helpfulness cracked, revealing a steely determination that was both impressive and alarming. "Mom Chen," she said, her voice taking on the tone she probably used with difficult clients in her pharmaceutical sales job, "you're being manipulated by a medical system that profits from keeping elderly patients dependent on unnecessary drugs. Dr. Williams doesn't care about your actual health. He cares about the revenue stream you represent to his practice." This accusation against Dr. Williams, who had literally saved my life after my heart attack, and had always been thoughtful and conservative in his treatment recommendations, made me realize just how deep Jessica's antipathy toward conventional medicine had become. She wasn't just questioning my specific medications anymore. She was challenging the entire foundation of modern cardiology. And she was doing it with the confidence of someone who believed she had discovered truths that the medical establishment was deliberately hiding. "Jessica," I said, standing up straighter and looking directly into her eyes, "Dr. Williams has been taking care of heart patients for 20 years. He went to medical school, completed a residency in internal medicine, and then specialized in cardiology. Your pharmaceutical sales training doesn't qualify you to second-guess his medical decisions, and I won't discuss this with you anymore." The finality in my voice seemed to surprise both of us. I hadn't spoken to anyone in my family with that kind of authority since Robert died, and Jessica clearly wasn't accustomed to having her medical opinions challenged so directly. For a moment, we stared at each other in silence, and I could see her calculating her next move in this power struggle that had escalated far beyond anything either of us had anticipated. "I think we should discuss this as a family," Jessica said finally, her voice regaining some of its usual smoothness. "David needs to understand what's happening here, and we need to make decisions together about how to handle your health care going forward. This affects all of us, not just you." The suggestion that my medical care was a family decision rather than a personal one revealed just how completely Jessica had redefined the boundaries of appropriate involvement in someone else's health. But her insistence on including David also gave me an opportunity to present my case to someone who might be more receptive to medical evidence than Jessica had proven to be. That evening, the three of us sat around the kitchen table for what Jessica called a family meeting about Mom Chen's health. She had prepared for this conversation like a business presentation, with printed articles about the dangers of polypharmacy in elderly patients and statistics about adverse drug reactions in my age group. She had even created a timeline showing my progress during the weeks when she had been controlling my medication intake, noting improvements in my energy level and mood that she attributed to reducing my pharmaceutical burden. David listened to Jessica's presentation with the respectful attention he always gave to her research projects, nodding appropriately and asking clarifying questions about the studies she cited. But when she finished her argument for continuing to limit my access to prescription medications, he surprised both of us by turning to me and asking what I thought about her proposals. "David," I said, choosing my words carefully, "I appreciate that Jessica is concerned about my health, but she's not qualified to make medical decisions for me. I have a serious heart condition that requires medication to prevent another heart attack. When I don't take these pills, my heart rhythm becomes irregular, and I experience chest pain. These aren't optional supplements. They're life-saving treatments that Dr. Williams prescribed based on my specific medical history and current condition." Jessica interrupted before David could respond. "Mom Chen, those symptoms you're describing could just as easily be anxiety about not having your pills. You've been conditioned to believe that you can't function without these drugs, but your body is perfectly capable of regulating itself naturally if you give it the chance." This dismissal of my physical symptoms as psychological dependence was so infuriating that I felt my carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "Jessica," I said, my voice rising slightly, "I'm not a drug addict going through withdrawal. I'm a heart patient who needs medication to keep my cardiovascular system functioning properly. There's a difference between psychological dependence and medical necessity, and you don't seem to understand that distinction." David looked uncomfortable with the tension building between his wife and his mother, but he also seemed to be processing what each of us was saying with more attention than he usually paid to these healthcare discussions. "Mom," he said slowly, "what does drive? What's not clear is why you believe you have the right to override my medical decisions and my doctor's recommendations." But let me make something very clear to you right now. You will not take my medications again. You will not interfere with my medical appointments. And you will not make healthcare decisions for me. Is that understood? The silence that followed my ultimatum was heavy with tension and surprise. David was staring at me as if he had never seen me before, and Jessica's face had gone pale with what looked like a mixture of shock and anger. I had never spoken to either of them with that kind of firmness, and my sudden assertion of authority had clearly disrupted their expectations about how this conversation would unfold. "Mom," David said finally, his voice uncertain, "I think we all want what's best for your health. Maybe we should schedule an appointment with Dr. Williams together so we can all hear his recommendations and discuss Jessica's concerns with him directly." This suggestion was exactly what I had been hoping David would propose, because I was confident that Dr. Williams would be able to explain the medical realities of my situation in a way that even Jessica would have difficulty dismissing. "That's an excellent idea, David," I said, sitting back down at the table but maintaining the authoritative posture I had discovered during my outburst. "I think Dr. Williams would be happy to address any questions Jessica has about my treatment plan." Jessica's expression suggested that she was less enthusiastic about submitting her medical theories to professional scrutiny, but she couldn't refuse David's reasonable suggestion without appearing to be afraid of having her ideas challenged. "Of course," she said, though her smile looked forced. "I'd be very interested to hear Dr. Williams explain his reasoning for keeping someone your age on such an extensive medication regimen." The appointment was scheduled for the following week, and in the days leading up to it, I could feel the dynamics in our household shifting in subtle but significant ways. Jessica continued to prepare healthy meals and maintain her wellness routines, but she no longer commented on my medication schedule or offered unsolicited advice about natural alternatives to my prescriptions. David seemed more attentive to my opinions about household decisions, as if my display of assertiveness had reminded him that I was a competent adult rather than a dependent who needed constant guidance. But I also sensed that Jessica was preparing for the appointment with Dr. Williams like a lawyer preparing for a crucial court case. She spent hours researching cardiovascular health and natural treatment approaches, and I often heard her on the phone with what sounded like medical professionals, asking detailed questions about heart medications and their alternatives. Her determination to prove that her approach was superior to conventional medicine seemed to be intensifying rather than diminishing as the appointment approached. The night before our meeting with Dr. Williams, Jessica knocked on my bedroom door and asked if she could talk to me privately. She seemed nervous and less confident than usual, and I wondered if she was having second thoughts about challenging my cardiologist's medical recommendations in front of David and me. "Mom Chen," she said, sitting on the edge of my bed with an expression that looked genuinely vulnerable, "I want you to know that everything I've done has been because I care about you and want you to be as healthy as possible. I know you think I'm overstepping, but I've seen so many elderly patients who become dependent on medications that do more harm than good. I don't want that to happen to you." This was the first time Jessica had acknowledged that her interference might be perceived as overstepping, and her admission of caring about me felt more genuine than many of our previous conversations. But her continued insistence that my medications were harmful rather than helpful showed that she hadn't fundamentally changed her position about my medical care. "Jessica," I said, trying to match her softer tone while still maintaining my newly discovered firmness, "I appreciate that you care about me, and I know your intentions are good. But caring about someone means respecting their right to make decisions about their own body and their own medical treatment. You can't love someone into giving up their autonomy, even if you genuinely believe your way is better." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her processing what I had said with more thoughtfulness than she usually brought to our discussions about healthcare. "I suppose I have been pretty controlling about this," she said finally. "It's just that I feel like I have knowledge that could help you, and it's frustrating when you won't consider alternatives that might be better for your long-term health." This acknowledgement of her controlling behavior was encouraging, but her continued belief that she knew what was better for my health than I did suggested that we still had fundamental disagreements about boundaries and autonomy. "Jessica," I said, "having knowledge doesn't give you the right to make decisions for other people, especially when that knowledge conflicts with professional medical advice. I value your concern, but I need you to trust that I'm capable of making informed decisions about my own healthcare." The conversation ended on a note that felt more hopeful than many of our recent interactions. But I also sensed that the real test of our relationship would come during the appointment with Dr. Williams. Jessica's willingness to acknowledge her controlling behavior was a positive step, but her fundamental belief that conventional medicine was harmful and that natural alternatives were superior hadn't changed. The meeting with my cardiologist would either validate her concerns or force her to confront the possibility that her approach was misguided and potentially dangerous. Dr. Williams' office felt different when I arrived with David and Jessica than it had during my solo appointments over the years. The familiar routine of checking in with the receptionist and waiting in the comfortable chairs suddenly felt charged with tension and anticipation. Jessica had brought a notebook filled with questions and printed articles, and David looked nervous about the potential conflict between his wife's strong opinions and his mother's medical needs. Dr. Williams greeted all three of us warmly and invited us into his office, where he had prepared for what he clearly understood would be more than a routine follow-up appointment. He had printed copies of my recent test results and a summary of my medication regimen, and he had arranged the chairs so that all of us could see his computer screen when he pulled up my medical records. Mrs. Chen has told me that there are some questions about her current treatment plan, Dr. Williams said, looking at Jessica with professional courtesy, but also with the wariness of someone who had dealt with family members who challenged medical recommendations. I'm happy to explain the reasoning behind each of her medications and to address any concerns you might have. Jessica opened her notebook and began asking questions that were clearly the result of extensive research and preparation. She asked about the long-term effects of beta blockers on heart function, the potential for blood thinners to cause dangerous bleeding, and the possibility that cholesterol-lowering medications might interfere with other bodily functions. Her questions were intelligent and well-informed, and Dr. Williams answered them patiently and thoroughly. But as the conversation continued, it became clear that Jessica's questions weren't really questions at all. They were challenges disguised as inquiries, designed to elicit information that she could use to support her predetermined conclusion that my medications were unnecessary and harmful. When Dr. Williams explained the specific medical reasons why each medication was essential for preventing future cardiac events, Jessica responded with articles she had found about patients who had successfully managed heart conditions through dietary changes and exercise. The turning point in the appointment came when Dr. Williams pulled up the results of my most recent electrocardiogram and echocardiogram, showing Jessica and David the specific abnormalities in my heart function that made medication necessary. The images on his computer screen showed areas of my heart that had been damaged by my previous heart attack, and regions where blood flow was compromised in ways that required pharmaceutical intervention to prevent further deterioration. Mrs. Chen's heart condition is not something that can be managed through lifestyle changes alone, Dr. Williams said, pointing to specific areas of concern on the test results. These medications aren't optional supplements or preventative measures. They're treatments for existing damage and dysfunction that will worsen without proper medical management. Discontinuing them would put her at immediate risk for another heart attack or stroke. Jessica studied the test results carefully, and I could see her struggling to reconcile the clear evidence of serious heart damage with her belief that natural approaches could address any health condition. But Dr. Williams, she said, her voice becoming less confident than it had been earlier in the appointment, surely there are natural ways to support heart function that could reduce her dependence on these medications. Dr. Williams nodded thoughtfully. Lifestyle modifications like diet and exercise are certainly important for heart health, and I always encourage my patients to pursue those approaches alongside their medical treatment. But Mrs. Chen's condition is too serious to rely on lifestyle changes alone. The damage to her heart requires pharmaceutical intervention to prevent life-threatening complications. David had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, and I could see him beginning to understand the seriousness of my medical situation in a way that Jessica's wellness presentations had never conveyed. Dr. Williams, he said, what would happen if my mother stopped taking these medications? The question hung in the air with terrible weight, and Dr. Williams' answer was delivered with the gravity that the situation deserved. Mr. Chen, your mother's heart medications are keeping her alive. Without the beta blocker, her heart rate and blood pressure could become dangerously unstable. Without the blood thinner, she's at high risk for blood clots that could cause a stroke or another heart attack. These aren't theoretical risks. They're immediate dangers that could manifest within days or weeks of discontinuing treatment. The stark reality of Dr. Williams's assessment seemed to shock both David and Jessica into silence. The conversation that had begun with Jessica's confident challenges to medical authority had evolved into a sobering education about the life-threatening nature of my condition and the essential role that medications played in keeping me alive. Jessica's notebook remained open on her lap, but she had stopped taking notes and asking questions. The evidence presented by Dr. Williams was too clear and too serious to dismiss, with articles about natural healing or concerns about pharmaceutical dependency. For the first time since she had begun interfering with my medical care, she seemed to be confronting the possibility that her approach could actually kill me. "I had no idea," David said quietly, looking at the test results on Dr. Williams' computer screen. "Mom, I thought your heart problems were more like high blood pressure or high cholesterol. I didn't realize you had actual damage that required this level of medical management." This admission revealed how much Jessica's confident presentations about natural healing had influenced David's understanding of my condition. Her dismissal of my medications as unnecessary had convinced him that my health problems were minor lifestyle issues rather than serious medical conditions, and his deference to her expertise had prevented him from seeking more accurate information about my cardiovascular status. Dr. Williams spent the remainder of the appointment educating David and Jessica about the realities of managing serious heart disease and the critical importance of medication compliance for patients in my situation. He explained that my condition would likely require lifelong pharmaceutical management, and that any changes to my medication regimen would need to be made gradually and under careful medical supervision. By the time we left Dr. Williams' office, the dynamic between the three of us had shifted dramatically. Jessica's confident assertions about natural healing had been replaced by quiet contemplation about the seriousness of my condition. David's casual acceptance of his wife's medical opinions had been replaced by a new understanding of how much he had misunderstood about my health needs. And my desperate efforts to protect myself from well-meaning but dangerous interference had been replaced by the relief of having medical authority clearly established. The drive home was subdued, with each of us processing what we had learned during the appointment. Jessica stared out the passenger window without speaking, and I could see her struggling to reconcile her strong beliefs about natural healing with the undeniable evidence that my condition required conventional medical treatment. David kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror with an expression that looked like a mixture of concern and guilt about how long he had allowed Jessica's interference to continue. When we arrived home, Jessica went directly to her room without participating in our usual post-appointment discussion about what we had learned. David lingered in the kitchen with me, clearly wanting to address what had happened but unsure how to begin a conversation about his wife's misguided attempts to control my medical care. "Mom," he said finally, "I owe you an apology. I should have taken your concerns about the medications more seriously, and I should have asked more questions about your condition instead of just accepting Jessica's research. I had no idea how serious your heart problems really are." This acknowledgement of his mistakes felt like a significant step toward rebuilding the trust and respect that had been eroded during the months of Jessica's medical interference. But I also understood that his primary loyalty would always be to his wife, and that any resolution to our conflicts would need to include Jessica's acceptance of appropriate boundaries around my healthcare. "David," I said, "I understand that Jessica's intentions were good, and I appreciate that she cares about my health. But good intentions don't justify taking someone's medications or overriding their doctor's recommendations. I need to know that this won't happen again, regardless of how strongly she believes in alternative approaches." He nodded solemnly, and I could see him mentally preparing for what would likely be a difficult conversation with Jessica about respecting my medical autonomy. The appointment with Dr. Williams had provided the medical authority and evidence that I had needed to establish my right to control my own health care. But the real test would be whether Jessica could accept the limitations of her knowledge and respect my decisions, even when they conflicted with her beliefs. That evening, I heard David and Jessica talking quietly in their room, and while I couldn't make out the specific words, the tone of their conversation suggested that they were having exactly the kind of serious discussion about boundaries and respect that our situation required. The next morning, Jessica appeared in the kitchen earlier than usual, looking tired and somewhat subdued. "Mom Chen," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee and sitting across from me at the breakfast table. "I want to apologize for taking your medications and for questioning your medical decisions. Dr. Williams made it very clear how serious your condition is, and I realized that my interference could have had dangerous consequences. This direct acknowledgement of her mistakes and their potential consequences felt like the breakthrough I had been hoping for since this whole ordeal began. But I also sensed that Jessica's apology, while sincere, was motivated more by the undeniable medical evidence we had received than by a fundamental change in her beliefs about healthcare and autonomy. "Jessica," I said, "I accept your apology, and I appreciate that you're willing to acknowledge what happened. But I need to know that you understand why your actions were so problematic. This wasn't just a disagreement about treatment approaches. You took control of my medical care without my consent, and without the qualifications to make those decisions safely." She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her processing the distinction between having strong opinions about healthcare and having the authority to make medical decisions for other people. "I suppose I got carried away with my research and my belief that I could help you find better alternatives," she said finally. "I didn't really think about how it would feel to have someone else controlling your access to medications that you depend on." This recognition of the emotional and psychological impact of her interference was encouraging, but I also needed her to understand the medical risks she had created. "Jessica," I said, "when you took my heart medication, you put my life in danger." Dr. Williams explained that stopping those pills abruptly could have triggered exactly the kind of cardiac event they're designed to prevent. "Your good intentions don't change the fact that your actions could have killed me." The starkness of this statement seemed to affect Jessica deeply, and I could see tears forming in her eyes as she contemplated the possible consequences of her misguided efforts to improve my health. "I never thought about it that way," she said quietly. "I was so focused on what I believed would be better for you in the long run that I didn't consider the immediate risks of changing your medications without medical supervision." This admission suggested that Jessica was beginning to understand the complexity of medical decision-making and the dangers of acting on incomplete knowledge, even when that knowledge was extensive and well-researched. But the real test of her understanding would be whether she could resist the temptation to interfere with my healthcare in the future, especially if she encountered new information that challenged conventional medical approaches. "Jessica," I said, "I value your concern about my health, and I don't want this situation to create permanent damage to our relationship. But going forward, I need you to respect that my medical care is my responsibility and my doctor's responsibility. You can share information that you think might be helpful, but you can't make decisions about my treatment or interfere with my medications." She nodded seriously, and for the first time since she had moved into our house, I felt like we were having a conversation between equals, rather than a discussion between someone who knew better and someone who needed guidance. "I understand," she said, "and I promise that I won't interfere with your medical care again. I may still have opinions about healthcare approaches, but I'll keep them to myself unless you specifically ask for my input." This commitment to respecting my medical autonomy felt like a genuine resolution to the immediate crisis, but I also understood that changing deeply held beliefs about healthcare and personal authority would be an ongoing process for Jessica. Her pharmaceutical sales background and her family's skepticism about conventional medicine had shaped her worldview in ways that wouldn't disappear overnight, and I would need to remain vigilant about protecting my independence while also maintaining the family relationships that were important to all of us. The weeks following our appointment with Dr. Williams brought a period of cautious rebuilding that tested everyone's commitment to the new boundaries we had established. Jessica kept her promise not to interfere with my medications, but I could sense her internal struggle as she watched me take pills each morning that she still believed might be unnecessary. Her pharmaceutical sales training had given her enough knowledge to maintain her skepticism about conventional treatments, even when faced with clear evidence of their necessity in my specific case. David seemed relieved that the immediate crisis had been resolved, but he also appeared to be grappling with guilt about how long he had allowed the situation to continue, without truly understanding the medical realities involved. He began asking more detailed questions about my health and showing genuine interest in my doctor's appointments, as if trying to compensate for the months when he had deferred entirely to Jessica's medical opinions. The real test of our new dynamic came during my next routine appointment with Dr. Williams, when he suggested adjusting one of my medications based on my recent blood work. The change was minor, involving a slight increase in my cholesterol medication to address some concerning lipid levels, but it represented exactly the kind of medical decision that would have previously triggered extensive debate and research from Jessica. When I mentioned the medication adjustment at dinner that evening, I watched Jessica's face carefully for signs that she might be tempted to challenge Dr. Williams' recommendation or suggest natural alternatives. I could see the internal battle playing out in her expression, her desire to share her knowledge about cholesterol management, conflicting with her promise to respect my medical autonomy. What kind of side effects should you watch for with the increased dosage? David asked, his question reflecting his new commitment to staying informed about my medical care without trying to control it. Dr. Williams said the main thing to monitor is muscle pain or weakness, I replied, appreciating David's engaged but respectful approach to my health information. He wants me to call his office if I experience any unusual symptoms, and he's scheduled additional blood work in 6 weeks to make sure the adjustment is working properly. Jessica nodded thoughtfully but didn't offer any commentary about alternative approaches to cholesterol management or concerns about increasing my pharmaceutical burden. Her restraint felt like a significant victory, evidence that she was genuinely trying to honor the boundaries we had established, even when it meant suppressing her strong opinions about medical treatment. But the real transformation in our household dynamics became apparent when Mrs. Patterson invited me to join a senior advocacy group that met monthly at the community center. The group focused on helping elderly residents navigate healthcare systems, understand their rights in medical decision-making, and maintain their independence as they aged. When I mentioned the invitation to David and Jessica, their responses revealed how much our recent crisis had changed their perceptions of my capabilities. "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity, Mom," David said enthusiastically. "You'd probably have a lot to contribute to a group like that, given everything you've learned about managing your own healthcare." Jessica's response was more measured but equally supportive. "I think it's great that you're interested in advocacy work, Mom Chen. You've shown incredible strength in standing up for your medical needs, and other seniors could probably benefit from hearing about your experience." These positive reactions to my involvement in activities outside our immediate household felt like evidence that both David and Jessica were beginning to see me as an independent adult, rather than a dependent family member who needed constant guidance and protection. The crisis over my medications had forced all of us to confront assumptions about age, competence, and autonomy that had been shaping our relationships in unhealthy ways. My first meeting with the senior advocacy group proved to be both enlightening and empowering. The dozen other participants shared stories about family members who had become overly controlling about their health care, medical professionals who had dismissed their concerns because of their age, and institutional systems that seemed designed to undermine, rather than support, elderly independence. Listening to their experiences, I realized that my conflict with Jessica was part of a much larger pattern of age-related discrimination that affected millions of older adults. The assumption that elderly people were inherently less capable of making complex decisions about their own lives was pervasive and destructive, leading to situations where well-meaning family members inadvertently became oppressive caregivers. Eleanor Michaels, the group's facilitator and a retired social worker, encouraged me to share my own story about medication interference and the strategies I had used to reclaim control over my medical care. As I described Jessica's misguided attempts to manage my health and my eventual success in establishing appropriate boundaries, I could see other group members nodding in recognition and taking notes about approaches they might use in their own situations. "Margaret," Eleanor said after I finished my account, "what you've described is unfortunately very common, but your response to it was remarkable. Many people in your situation never find the courage to assert their independence, especially when the interference comes from family members who genuinely believe they're being helpful." This validation of my actions and recognition of the courage they had required felt profoundly meaningful. For months I had questioned whether I was being unreasonable in resisting Jessica's health interventions, wondering if my insistence on maintaining control over my medical care was selfish or stubborn. Hearing from other seniors who had faced similar challenges helped me understand that my fight for autonomy was both necessary and admirable. The advocacy group also provided practical resources for maintaining independence as we aged, including information about advance directives, healthcare proxies, and legal protections for elderly people who faced interference from family members or caregivers. I learned about organizations that could provide support for seniors dealing with controlling relatives and legal remedies available for situations where family interference crossed the line into elder abuse. Armed with this new knowledge and surrounded by a supportive community of peers, I began to develop a more comprehensive plan for protecting my independence as I continued to age. The crisis with Jessica had awakened me to the vulnerability of my situation and the importance of taking proactive steps to ensure that I could maintain control over my own life, regardless of how my health or living circumstances might change in the future. One of the most significant steps I took was updating my Advanced Healthcare Directive to include specific language about my commitment to evidence-based medical care and my opposition to family members making medical decisions based on unscientific beliefs or internet research. I also designated Mrs. Patterson as my healthcare proxy, ensuring that someone who understood and respected my medical preferences would be able to advocate for me if I ever became unable to do so myself. The conversation with David and Jessica about these legal documents was delicate but necessary. I needed them to understand that my preparations weren't motivated by distrust of their intentions, but by recognition that good intentions weren't sufficient protection against harmful interference. My experience with Jessica's medication control had taught me that love and concern could become oppressive when they weren't balanced with respect for autonomy and professional expertise. "Mom," David said when I explained my decision to designate Mrs. Patterson as my healthcare proxy, "I understand why you feel like you need someone outside the family to make medical decisions for you, but it hurts to think that you don't trust us to respect your wishes." This response revealed that David still didn't fully comprehend the seriousness of what had happened, or the importance of having safeguards in place to prevent similar incidents in the future. His focus on his own hurt feelings rather than on my need for protection suggested that he was still thinking about this situation in terms of family dynamics rather than medical safety. "David," I said gently but firmly, "this isn't about trust or family relationships. It's about ensuring that medical decisions are made by people who understand and respect medical science." Jessica genuinely believed that she was helping me when she took my medications, but her good intentions could have killed me. I need to know that my healthcare decisions will be made by someone who will defer to medical expertise rather than personal beliefs about natural healing. Jessica had been listening to this conversation in silence, but my reference to her previous interference prompted her to speak up. "Mom Chen, I understand why you feel like you need those protections, and I don't blame you for wanting someone who will prioritize conventional medical treatment. I still have concerns about some aspects of modern medicine, but I recognize that my knowledge has limitations and that my beliefs shouldn't override professional medical judgment." This acknowledgement felt like a significant step in Jessica's understanding of appropriate boundaries, but I also sensed that she was still struggling with the fundamental conflict between her personal beliefs and the medical realities of my condition. Her pharmaceutical sales background had given her confidence in her ability to evaluate medical treatments, and completely abandoning that confidence would require a level of intellectual humility that might be difficult for her to maintain long-term. The true test of our new family dynamic came several months later when I experienced what turned out to be a minor cardiac episode that required a brief hospitalization and adjustment of my medication regimen. The incident occurred on a Saturday morning while I was working in my garden, and the chest pain and shortness of breath were severe enough that Mrs. Patterson, who witnessed the episode, insisted on calling an ambulance despite my initial protests. David and Jessica met me at the emergency room, and I could see the fear and concern in their faces as they waited for updates about my condition. Dr. Williams arrived at the hospital within an hour and explained that I had experienced what he called an unstable angina episode that required immediate attention but wasn't a full heart attack. The incident was serious enough to warrant overnight observation and would likely require changes to my medication regimen to prevent similar events in the future. As Dr. Williams explained the treatment plan and medication adjustments that would be necessary, I watched Jessica's reaction carefully. The medical crisis represented exactly the kind of situation where she might be tempted to question conventional treatment approaches or suggest alternative interventions. Her response would reveal whether our previous conflicts had genuinely changed her understanding of appropriate boundaries, or whether the stress of a medical emergency might cause her to revert to her previous patterns of interference. Jessica listened to Dr. Williams' explanations with focused attention, asking clarifying questions about the timeline for my recovery and the expected effects of the medication changes. But her questions were directed toward understanding his recommendations rather than challenging them, and she didn't suggest any alternative approaches or express skepticism about the necessity of the treatments he prescribed. "Dr. Williams," she said at one point, "is there anything we should watch for at home that might indicate Mom Chen is having problems with the new medications? I want to make sure we're supporting her recovery properly without overreacting to normal adjustment symptoms." This question demonstrated exactly the kind of supportive but respectful involvement that I had been hoping Jessica could learn to provide. She was seeking information that would help her care for me appropriately without trying to substitute her judgment for medical expertise or second-guess professional recommendations. The days following my hospital discharge were challenging as my body adjusted to the new medication regimen, but they also provided evidence that our family had successfully navigated the crisis of boundaries and respect that had threatened our relationships earlier. Jessica monitored my symptoms and energy levels with careful attention, but she reported her observations to Dr. Williams rather than interpreting them as evidence that changes needed to be made to my treatment plan. David took time off work to help with my initial recovery, driving me to follow-up appointments and managing household tasks that I temporarily couldn't handle myself. His involvement felt genuinely supportive rather than controlling, and he consistently deferred to my preferences about my care while ensuring that I had access to whatever assistance I needed. The most meaningful moment in our transformed family dynamic came when Dr. Williams complimented Jessica on her thoughtful questions and appropriate level of involvement during one of my follow-up appointments. It's refreshing to work with family members who understand the balance between caring and interfering, he told her. Your support for Mrs. Chen's recovery has been exemplary. Jessica's face lit up with pride at this professional recognition of her appropriate behavior, and I could see that Dr. Williams' approval meant more to her than any validation I could have provided. Her pharmaceutical sales background had made her sensitive to medical professionals' opinions, and having a cardiologist acknowledge her constructive involvement seemed to reinforce her commitment to maintaining appropriate boundaries. As my health stabilized and I regained my normal energy levels, I began to reflect on the profound changes that had occurred in our family relationships over the past year. The crisis with Jessica's medication interference had forced all of us to confront fundamental questions about autonomy, authority, and love that many families never address until they face serious medical or end-of-life decisions. Jessica's journey from controlling interference to supportive respect had required her to develop a level of intellectual humility that conflicted with her professional training and personal beliefs. Her willingness to acknowledge the limitations of her knowledge and defer to medical expertise represented a significant personal growth that extended far beyond our specific conflict about my medications. David's evolution from passive deference to engaged support had required him to take responsibility for understanding my medical needs, rather than relying on his wife to interpret and manage all healthcare decisions. His new involvement in my medical care felt more mature and appropriate than his previous approach of avoiding anything that seemed complicated or emotionally challenging. My own transformation from confused and frightened widow to confident advocate for my own medical needs had required me to rediscover strengths and capabilities that I had allowed to atrophy during the years when Robert handled most of our complex decisions. The crisis had forced me to develop skills and confidence that served me well beyond the immediate situation. The senior advocacy group that had provided such valuable support during my initial crisis asked me to speak at their annual conference about strategies for maintaining medical autonomy when faced with well-meaning but misguided family interference. Preparing for this presentation required me to articulate the lessons I had learned and the approaches that had been most effective in resolving our family conflict. Standing before an audience of elderly adults and their family members, I spoke about the importance of clear communication about medical preferences, the value of professional medical expertise, and the necessity of maintaining respect for individual autonomy even within loving families. I emphasized that good intentions weren't sufficient justification for overriding someone else's medical decisions, and that true care required respecting people's right to make informed choices about their own bodies and health. The response to my presentation was overwhelmingly positive, with many attendees approaching me afterward to share their own stories of family conflicts over medical care and to ask for advice about establishing appropriate boundaries. Several adult children thanked me for helping them understand how their well-meaning attempts to manage their parents' health care might be perceived as controlling or disrespectful. One particularly meaningful conversation was with a woman whose daughter had been pressuring her to stop taking antidepressants because of concerns about pharmaceutical dependency. The woman's daughter, like Jessica, had done extensive research about the potential side effects of psychiatric medications and genuinely believed that natural approaches would be healthier for her mother. But the woman's depression was serious enough that discontinuing her medication could have led to suicidal thoughts or behaviors. Listening to her story, I was reminded of how dangerous it could be when people with partial medical knowledge made decisions about complex health conditions. The woman's daughter had focused on potential risks of antidepressant medications without understanding the much greater risks associated with untreated depression. Her concern for her mother's well-being had led her to advocate for changes that could have had devastating consequences. I shared with this woman some of the strategies that had been most effective in my situation, including the importance of involving medical professionals in family discussions about treatment decisions, and the value of clear documentation about medical preferences and boundaries. But I also emphasized that each family's situation was unique, and that the approaches that had worked for me might need to be adapted for different circumstances and relationships. The months following my presentation at the advocacy conference brought a new stability to our household that felt both comfortable and sustainable. Jessica had found ways to channel her interest in health and wellness into activities that didn't involve controlling other people's medical decisions. She began volunteering at a community garden that provided fresh produce for low-income families, and she started teaching cooking classes focused on heart-healthy nutrition. These activities allowed Jessica to share her knowledge about health and nutrition in contexts where her expertise was welcomed and appropriate, rather than trying to impose her beliefs on family members who hadn't asked for her guidance. Her volunteer work also connected her with other people who shared her interests in natural approaches to health, providing her with a community where her beliefs were validated and supported. David's increased involvement in my medical care had led to a broader strengthening of our relationship that extended beyond healthcare decisions. He began consulting me about work challenges and personal decisions, treating me as a valued advisor rather than a dependent who needed protection from complex problems. Our conversations became more substantive and engaging, reflecting his new recognition of my competence and wisdom. The most significant long-term change in our family dynamic was the establishment of regular family meetings, where we discussed household decisions, financial planning, and healthcare preferences in a format that respected everyone's autonomy while maintaining open communication. These meetings provided a structured way to address potential conflicts before they escalated into crises, like the one we had experienced over my medications. During one of these family meetings, David mentioned that he and Jessica had been discussing the possibility of purchasing their own home rather than continuing to live with me indefinitely. This conversation could have been emotionally charged, given the recent conflicts we had navigated, but the new level of respect and communication in our relationships allowed us to discuss it thoughtfully and openly. "Mom," David said, "we've been looking at houses in the neighborhood, and we found one that we really like. But we want to make sure that you're comfortable living alone and that you have adequate support systems in place before we make any decisions about moving." This considerate approach to a major life change reflected how much our family dynamic had evolved since the medication crisis. Rather than making assumptions about my needs or capabilities, David and Jessica were involving me in their decision-making process and ensuring that my preferences were considered alongside their own desires for independence. "I think it would be wonderful for you to have your own home," I told them honestly. "I'm grateful for the time we've had living together, and I feel confident about managing my own household with the support systems I've developed. Mrs. Patterson and I have become close friends, and the senior advocacy group has connected me with other resources for maintaining my independence." Jessica's response to this conversation demonstrated how much her understanding of my capabilities had changed since our early conflicts. "Mom Chen," she said, "I've been amazed by how well you've managed your health and advocated for yourself over the past year. I have complete confidence in your ability to live independently, and I know you have people you can call if you ever need assistance." This acknowledgement of my competence and independence felt like a profound validation of the journey we had all taken together. The woman who had once hidden my medications because she believed I couldn't make appropriate medical decisions was now expressing complete confidence in my ability to manage my own life and health. The process of David and Jessica moving into their own home provided opportunities for all of us to demonstrate the new levels of respect and consideration that had emerged from our previous conflicts. They involved me in discussions about timing and logistics, ensured that I was comfortable with their moving plans, and established ongoing communication patterns that would maintain our family connections without compromising anyone's independence. On the day they moved out, Jessica gave me a heartfelt card that included a written apology for her previous interference with my medical care and a commitment to maintaining the respectful boundaries we had established. "Thank you for teaching me that love sometimes means stepping back and trusting people to make their own decisions," she wrote. "I'm grateful for your patience as I learned how to be supportive without being controlling." This written acknowledgement of her growth and my role in facilitating it felt like a meaningful conclusion to the most challenging period in our relationship. The woman who had once dismissed my medical judgment as incompetent was now thanking me for teaching her important lessons about respect and autonomy. Living alone again after more than a year of sharing my home with David and Jessica felt like a return to an independence I had almost forgotten I valued. The quiet house allowed me to establish my own routines and rhythms without considering other people's preferences or schedules. I could take my medications at whatever time felt most convenient, without worrying about whether anyone was monitoring or questioning my choices. But the solitude also gave me time to reflect on the positive aspects of the time we had spent living together, and the ways that our conflicts had ultimately strengthened our relationships. Jessica's misguided attempts to control my medical care had forced all of us to confront important questions about family dynamics, personal autonomy, and appropriate boundaries that many families never address until they face serious crises. The skills I had developed in advocating for my medical needs and asserting my independence served me well in other areas of my life as I continued to age. I became more confident about making financial decisions, more assertive about my preferences in social situations, and more willing to pursue activities and interests that brought me personal satisfaction, regardless of whether other people understood or approved of my choices. 6 months after David and Jessica moved into their own home, I received a phone call that tested everything I had learned about medical advocacy and family dynamics. My sister Helen, who lived across the country, had been hospitalized after a fall that resulted in multiple fractures and a concussion. Her adult daughter was making decisions about her medical care that seemed inappropriate and potentially harmful, including refusing recommended surgical interventions because of concerns about the risks of anesthesia for someone Helen's age. Using the skills I had developed during my own medical advocacy journey, I was able to help Helen navigate the complex family dynamics that were interfering with her medical care. I spoke with her doctors to understand the medical recommendations, helped Helen articulate her own preferences about treatment, and provided support for her efforts to maintain control over her medical decisions despite her daughter's well-meaning but misguided interference. The situation with Helen reinforced my understanding of how common these conflicts were, and how important it was for elderly people to have advocates who understood both medical realities and family dynamics. My own experience with Jessica's medication interference had prepared me to recognize the warning signs of inappropriate family involvement, and to provide effective support for someone facing similar challenges. As I helped Helen work through her medical crisis, I realized that my difficult journey with Jessica had transformed me into exactly the kind of advocate and support person that I had needed during my own darkest moments. The crisis that had once felt so overwhelming and threatening had actually equipped me with skills and insights that enabled me to help other people facing similar challenges. The advocacy work that had begun as a personal necessity during my conflict with Jessica evolved into a meaningful contribution to my community and a source of ongoing purpose and satisfaction. I began volunteering with organizations that provided support for elderly people navigating healthcare systems and family conflicts, and I found that my firsthand experience with medical interference made me particularly effective in these roles. Looking back on the entire experience, from the morning I first discovered my missing medications to the day I helped Helen advocate for appropriate medical care, I can see that Jessica's misguided attempts to control my health had actually initiated a process of personal growth and empowerment that changed my life in profoundly positive ways. The crisis had forced me to rediscover strengths I didn't know I still possessed, and to develop new skills that served me well, far beyond the immediate situation. The woman who had once felt helpless and confused about her own medical care had become someone who could confidently navigate complex healthcare systems, assert her preferences with medical professionals, and provide support for other people facing similar challenges. The family relationships that had been strained by conflicts over boundaries and respect had evolved into connections that were stronger and more honest than they had been before the crisis. Most importantly, I had learned that true love and care required respecting people's autonomy and trusting their ability to make informed decisions about their own lives. Jessica's journey from controlling interference to supportive respect had taught all of us that good intentions weren't sufficient justification for overriding someone else's choices, and that genuine care meant empowering people rather than protecting them from their own decisions. The morning sun streams through my kitchen window as I sit at the table with my current medication organizer, all compartments properly filled with the pills that keep my heart functioning and my life stable. The pills are the same ones Dr. Williams prescribed years ago, adjusted and refined based on ongoing medical monitoring, but never again subject to interference from well-meaning family members who believe they know better than medical professionals. Jessica calls every Sunday to check on my well-being, and our conversations have found a comfortable balance between caring interest and respectful boundaries. She shares information about new health research when she thinks it might interest me, but she never suggests that I should change my medical regimen or questions the wisdom of my treatment decisions. Her pharmaceutical sales career has continued to flourish, and she has found ways to channel her passion for health and wellness into appropriate professional contexts. David stops by every few weeks to help with household projects and to maintain the father-son relationship that had been strained during our conflicts over medical boundaries. Our time together now feels relaxed and genuine, unmarked by the tension and guilt that had characterized our interactions when he felt caught between his loyalty to his wife and his concern for his mother. The senior advocacy group continues to meet monthly, and I have taken on a leadership role in organizing educational programs about medical rights and family dynamics. The work feels meaningful and important, connecting me with other people who share my commitment to maintaining independence and dignity as we age. Mrs. Patterson remains my healthcare proxy and my closest friend, a reminder that some of the most important relationships in our lives can emerge from the most challenging circumstances. Her steady support during my medical crisis had provided exactly the kind of advocacy and validation that I had needed, and our ongoing friendship continues to enrich my life in countless ways. The locked drawer that once symbolized everything I didn't know about my own marriage has been replaced by filing cabinets where I organize my own medical records, financial documents, and legal papers. The contrast between the hidden secrets that once shaped my life and the transparent organization of my current affairs serves as a daily reminder of how much my relationship with information and control has changed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.